I would like to suggest that Mary Whitehouse is the most prurient woman in England. She can see sex or filth or anything in a curtain being drawn or a blind being drawn down. She has a disgustingly dirty mind.
Welcome back to the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where we combine two different movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and after my recent excursions to Spain, New Mexico and Italy, this week I'm going to be staying in the UK. But don't let that fool you into thinking things are going to be nice and warm and cosy. First up, we're looking at Frightmare from 1974, Pete Walker's grim and transgressive take on family dysfunction. I'm going to be following that up with Possum from 2018, a suffocatingly bleak nightmare about trauma and repression from director Matthew Holness. Two films separated by decades, but bound by their shared preoccupation with horror lurking in the ordinary, within families and within the suburbs. Along the way, I'll also be diving into the cultural anxieties from the 1970s that birthed both of these films, how Frightmare taps into the moral panic of the decade and the reactionary pushback of the UK's so-called Festival of Light movement, and also how Possum reflects not just the imagery of the era, but also the long haunting shadow of childhood trauma. Both of this week's films are firmly rooted in the 1970s. Frightmare was, of course, made and released in 1974, and Possum is both visually and tonally very much the product of a 1970s childhood. Having grown up in Britain in the 1970s myself, before we explore either of this week's movies, I think it's worth travelling back in time to a period in which the UK was adrift in economic malaise, industrial unrest, and an atmosphere fairly thick with paranoia. During this era, people lived in a world of fairly hideous brown furniture, large orange glass ashtrays, and sofas so big you could lose a child in them. The lights would flicker out at odd hours because the government, in a quite brilliant display of late imperial decline, had introduced the 3-day week. Bin men were on strike, the power kept going out, and the air was thick with the smell of 3-day-old rubbish and damp shagpile carpet. You also couldn't move for doom. Turn on the TV and you might stumble across the series Survivors from creator Terry Nation, one of the brains behind classic Doctor Who. This was a bleak post-pandemic drama where civilization collapses under the weight of a mystery virus. And if that didn't unsettle you, and trust me, it certainly unsettled me, then the public information films that were ever present on TV most certainly would. These were genuinely terrifying, grim and clinical short films, warning children, and some adults, about the dangers of everything, whether it was playing near railway lines or electricity substations, polishing a wooden floor at the bottom of the stairs a little bit too much, or filling a kettle too full and not putting the lid on properly. Two in particular haunt the collective memory. There is The Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water from 1973. In this, Donald Pleasance gives voice to a grim reaper figure lurking near rivers and canals, waiting to claim the lives of careless children. The imagery is pure nightmare fuel, drifting empty coats, sudden drownings, and shadowy figures watching from the reeds. This was then followed in 1977 by Apaches, which is a film about farm safety and, quite frankly, might as well be a horror movie. A group of kids play on a farm, dying one by one in a series of gruesome accidents, falling into a slurry pit, getting crushed under a tractor, or being poisoned by pesticides. I was first introduced to it at the age of about 8. I grew up in rural Cornwall and was surrounded by farm buildings, with all of their apparent and many dangers, so the film had a particular resonance, though admittedly probably not in the way that the producers intended. I clearly remember a conversation in the school playground where an older child, having already seen it, advised me to look out for the moment that one of the kids falls into the slurry pit. All we could discuss for days afterwards were the possibilities of how they'd filmed it. And it wasn't just the public information films that aimed to terrify a generation. Children's TV seemed specifically designed to scare the living shit out of you. Children of the Stones gave us a cursed village ruled by druidic forces. The series The Changes suggested that any day now the entire country might suddenly turn on its own technology in a fit of mass hysteria, smashing fridges, radios and TV sets like a band of possessed Luddites. The educational series The Boy from Space gave us a truly terrifying antagonist in the form of the Thin Man, a trench coat and trilby-wearing alien who makes Phantasm's The Tall Man pale by comparison. And then Sapphire and Steel turned up, a kind of metaphysical detective agency fronted by Joanna Lumley and David McCallum, who battled time anomalies in empty houses where clocks suddenly stop, people disappear, and monsters with blank faces trap hapless victims in photographs and then burn them alive. It was all deeply unnerving, and like much of the 1970s, seemed designed to confuse and frighten children, which it did, and then just for safe measure, did it a little bit more. And if this wasn't enough, just below all of this ran a low thrum of anxiety about rabies, if we're honest. Anti-rabies posters were everywhere, warning Britain of the slavering continental hounds that were ready to sneak into the country via ferry and infect the entire population. I distinctly remember being both fascinated and terrified by one that hung on the wall in our local village post office, a grinning skull that I both wanted to turn away from, but was also strangely compelled to stare at. Much like quicksand, though, or the Bermuda Triangle, it was a fear that may have been ever present in the cultural atmosphere and always looming, but it never actually happened to anyone that you knew. And perhaps most terrifying of all, in 1971, a counter-movement arose, not from the communes or the nightclubs, but from church halls and suburban sitting rooms. It was called the Nationwide Festival of Light, and though that might sound like a psychedelic music festival, it was, in fact, anything but. The Nationwide Festival of Light was founded in November 1970 when a young couple, Peter and Janet Hill, who sound very much like the grown-up protagonists of an Enid Blyton novel, returned to England after 4 years as evangelical Baptist missionaries in India, and that probably tells you everything you need to know about them. On their return, the Hills were horrified when they discovered that, shock horror, sexually explicit content was suddenly prevalent in mass media. They co-founded the National Festival of Light to oppose what they referred to as pornography and moral pollution, and were joined by the journalist and author Malcolm Muggeridge, Clean Up TV campaigner Mary Whitehouse, and Labour Cabinet Minister Lord Longford. The movement was drastically opposed to what they saw as the growing trends in mass media for the explicit depiction of sexual and violent themes, and they aimed to reinstate and restore conservative Christian morality and family values. Mrs. Whitehouse, a schoolteacher turned moral crusader, had already made a name for herself railing against the so-called permissive society. Mary believed that Britain was in the grip of a moral decline, and that television, cinema, and literature was responsible for corrupting the nation's soul. This was particularly the case with the BBC, which she treated as a sort of Sodom and Gomorrah with a broadcasting licence. The festival was her most ambitious undertaking yet, a full-blown moral revival, taking Christianity to the streets, armed with hymn books, tea flasks, and Cliff Richard. It was supported by a mix of conservative Christians, family campaigners, and some rather more fringe figures who all felt that Britain had gone to the dogs. It launched with rallies and public marches, calling for a return to what they described as traditional family values. They protested against pornography, indecent films, LGBTQ rights, liberal sex education, and the general sense that youngsters those days were enjoying themselves a little bit too much. In many ways, the Festival of Light was Britain's answer to America's moral majority, only with a few more cardigans, cups of tea, and fewer televangelists. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, the festival didn't really succeed in reversing the tide of change, but it did stir up national debates around censorship, freedom of expression, and the role of religion in public life. And whilst it ended not with a bang but with a whimper, it set the tone for decades of cultural skirmishes to come, including the 1980s video nasty controversy, which we'll be discussing in a few weeks' time. So why is all of this important, you might ask? Well, for many British creatives, the Festival of Light and Mrs. Whitehouse not only represented an inconvenience in terms of artistic expression and freedom, but also something to rail against within their own movies. And nowhere can we see this more clearly than in the early horror films of our first director this week, Pete Walker. So before we get into the movies, I want to quickly mention some of the sources that I've used while researching the films. For the discussion on Frightmare, I've referred to the books Making Mischief, The Cult Films of Pete Walker by Steve Chibnall, English Gothic, Classic Horror Cinema 1987 to 2015 by Jonathan Rigby, and Nightmare Movies by Kim Newman. When discussing Possum, I've referred to an interview with Matthew Holness on Film 4 in 2018, a quite brilliant essay called Waking Up Is It? Childhood Trauma, Repression, and Freud's Uncanny in Possum, and that's written by C.H. Newell and will be linked in the show notes. And for both films, I've referred to a number of interviews and videos that are all available on YouTube, and again, these will all be linked in the show notes. Frightmare was released in 1974 and was produced and directed by Pete Walker. It was written by his frequent collaborator David McGillivray and stars Sheila Keith, Rupert Davies, Deborah Fairfax, Paul Greenwood, and Kim Butcher. The film opens with an incredibly bleak and atmospheric prologue, and full disclosure, I have blatantly stolen this from Jonathan Rigby's quite masterful introduction to the movie at the House of Walker retrospective, which was held in London in 2014, and that's one of the videos that's linked in the show notes. So, if you're all sitting comfortably, I'll begin. It is a late Sunday afternoon in midwinter. The Thames looks grey and deserted. Along the skyline, the only signs of life seem to be the blackening smoke from Battersea Power Station. We superimpose a title, London, February the 18th, 1957. High angle of Battersea Pleasure Gardens, long since closed for the winter. A solitary figure walks across the damp tarmac amidst the tarpaulin-covered sideshows. Closer angle, the man is Barry Nichols, an insignificant character of indefinable age, but probably around his early 30s, one of many occupying the 1001 one-room flatlets in Clapham, or thereabouts. He seems unsure of himself as he arrives at one of the once gaily coloured huts, now half covered in tarpaulin. He tries to peer into a murky window set high in the woodwork. Then he knocks at the weather-beaten door. A pause. The door creaks open very slightly. Barry squints into the gloomy interior, and tarpaulin flaps in the sharp wind. This sets the tone for Frightmare, a film that's every bit as bleak and unsettling as that opening passage suggests. It's Pete Walker's third horror movie, and at the time, it really wasn't that well received. In fact, it was absolutely slaughtered by the critics. But for me, Frightmare is Walker's best work, and it seems that the director himself would agree. In the book Making Mischief, the cult films of Pete Walker, he is quoted as saying, quote, "It's the only film that I would look back on and say, that's the one. If somebody said, oh, you used to be a film director once, show us one of your films, that's the one I would show. Yes, it's a violent film, but it did actually have the moral tale that I wanted it to have, and I told it in no uncertain terms. I believed at the end that I had made the point." End quote. Now, there's a fair amount to unpack in terms of what the point Walker was making actually was. And I have to say, whilst I do really enjoy this film, I don't necessarily agree with the message. But before we get into all of that, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Walker himself. Pete Walker was born on July the 4th, 1939, in Brighton, on the south coast of England, the town from which I am actually recording this podcast. His parents were both performers. His father was a music hall star, and his mother was a showgirl, all of which sounds incredibly romantic. But Walker himself describes his childhood as being very insecure. He was born outside of marriage, which was a scandalous thing at the time, and on top of that, as you can tell from the date, he was born just as World War II was breaking out, which meant that he lost his father to the war. Now, the history of film directors is, of course, full of stories about young people escaping the grimness of life by going to the cinema and watching movies, and Walker is no exception to this. Interestingly, though, before he got into filmmaking, he actually tried his hand at stand-up comedy, working in the adult revue bars of Soho in London, and he also took on bit-part acting roles. It was, however, in exploitation cinema that he started to really make his name, beginning with 8mm glamour shorts, before moving on to 35mm sexploitation comedies in the late 60s, movies with titles like I Like Birds, Strip Poker, and School for Sex. Unlike some of his American contemporaries, people like Russ Meyer or Doris Wishman, Walker wasn't particularly enamoured with the sexploitation market. It was much more of a means to an end. He soon transitioned into crime thrillers like Man of Violence and the quite brilliantly titled Die Screaming Marianne, which starred a young Susan George. But it was with the horror genre, starting in 1972 with the movie The Flesh and Blood Show, that he really made a name for himself. Over a 10-year period, Walker made 7 horror films, and while they're all interesting in their own way, there are 3 that stand out because of the social commentary that underpins them. House of Whipcord, released in 1974, was a brutal attack on the British legal system and moral crusaders like the aforementioned Mary Whitehouse and the Festival of Light. In the film, Walker takes aim at the self-appointed guardians of decency, depicting a former prison governess and her judge husband as a couple of sadists who set up a private correctional facility to punish immoral young women. The film is basically asking what happens when the people who want to clean up society are actually the real perverts themselves. He followed this in the same year with Frightmare, which we're talking about today, which is a disturbing look at the psychiatric profession and also at so-called family values. In 1976, he released The House of Mortal Sin, which is a scathing critique of the Catholic Church, featuring a homicidal priest who kills people with poisoned communion wafers or strangles them with rosary beads. As you can tell, subtlety was not really Walker's strong point, particularly by the time we get to The House of Mortal Sin, but his films do have a resonance today. One of the things that's very interesting about these early 3 films is that, despite being written and directed by men, they are in many ways women's films, though one could hardly call them feminist. What I mean is the female characters tend to be the strongest and the most compelling, and the ones who drive the narrative, and the male protagonists are often ineffectual at best, or outright useless at worst. In my research, I've seen Pete Walker compared, tonally, if not visually, to Michael Reeves, the serious and tragically short-lived director behind Witchfinder General and The Sorcerers. And that's a very interesting comparison, particularly when looking at the 3 films I've just mentioned. All 3 of them have a recurrent theme, also present in Reeves' work, of an older generation preying on and ultimately destroying the young. Kim Newman, in his book Nightmare Movies, writes, quote, "There is a touch of Michael Reeves about his caricaturing of a legal system in House of Whipcord, the family in Frightmare, and the Roman Catholic Church in House of Mortal Sin as perfidious institutions for the repression, perversion, and the torture of the young by the old." End quote. Meanwhile, in the book Making Mischief, Steve Chibnall adds, quote, "Neither filmmaker seems to hold out much hope for the resilience of goodness and freedom in the face of the powerful forces of violence and corruption, which emanate from the past and pervade the present. Walker's pessimism, however, lacks Reeves' sense of despair, and is both more cynical and good-humoured. End quote. I'd also say there is a very big difference between Walker and Reeves. Reeves was absolutely 100% serious about his films and their messages, whereas Walker was, by his own admission, far more exploitative. He's admitted that the social and political themes were partly included to help his movies get past the censors, masquerading as more serious pieces of work, and also because he wanted to rub people up the wrong way, cause controversy, and earn a lot of money. So for me, there's as much, if not more, of a William Castle, Roger Corman, or dare I say it, Herschel Gordon Lewis sensibility in Walker's work than there is of Michael Reeves. Yes, the films do have an underlying social commentary, but first and foremost, they're money-making shock machines. And isn't that really what exploitation cinema is all about? Walker himself, quite admirably, seemed to recognise when his time as a director was coming to an end. He retired from filmmaking in his early 40s, saying, quote, "I figured I was too old to be making films for teenagers. It was a conscious decision. I could see that I wasn't totally in touch with the market, whereas when I first started out, I was. I thought, quit while you're winning." End quote. So now we're going to get on to talk specifically about the film, and I'm going to be getting into spoilers. So if you haven't seen it yet, it is available on Shudder, and it's also available on YouTube. Frightmare was released in 1974, and its release was actually overshadowed by a Christmas bombing campaign in London carried out by the IRA. This didn't really help its box office performance, but what really hurt it was the reception from the British media, and let's just say they didn't hold back. The Daily Express, before they became obsessed with both the weather and Princess Diana, said, quote, "It doesn't pay to look too closely at the plot of this horror film. Much better to not look at it at all. All I can say is that the people who made this rubbish and appeared in it should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves, and that anyone attracted to it should head for the nearest psychiatrist." End quote. The Daily Telegraph was a little bit more succinct. Quote, "We can all, I think, manage without Pete Walker's Frightmare." End quote. The Guardian dismissed it as both ridiculous and nasty. The Times went for a full takedown, calling it nasty, foolish, and morally repellent. The Daily Mail, in a quite spectacular display of irony given the nature of that publication, called it a moral obscenity, and the Sunday Times described it as a repellent little shocker. Now, I don't know about you, but if I saw all of that on a film poster, I'd probably go and see the movie all the more quickly. And Walker and his screenwriter, David McGillivray, clearly felt the same way. They included many of these reviews in the film's marketing materials, and you can see them on the poster. Walker would, however, later go on to say that he didn't really think the film deserved quite such a harsh reception. Interestingly, the film was positively reviewed by Films and Filming and the Monthly Film Bulletin, but these weren't exactly publications that your average cinema goer was reading. So what was it that got the critics so up in arms? I mean, to be honest, Frightmare is nasty, it is repellent, and it is morally outrageous. But you could say the same thing about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was released the same year. What really caused offence in this film wasn't so much the gore, or Sheila Keith viciously wielding a power drill. It was the themes that the film was exploring. In particular, its attitude towards psychiatry and mental health care. Walker has been incredibly vocal in his interviews, both at the time and more recently, about his belief that the psychiatric profession is, at best, ineffective, and at worst, outright dangerous. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here. What I'm talking about are Pete Walker's views and not mine. I'm actually a huge advocate for therapy and mental health care. I've personally benefited from it, as have many people I know. So when I'm talking about these themes and discussions, I'm discussing Walker's perspective, and not mine. I think to really understand the movie and the message behind it, it's important to look at the history of mental health care in the UK, because like most movies, this film didn't exist in a vacuum. It was a reaction, an incredibly conscious one, to a system in flux, and to public fears about how mental illness was being treated, or perhaps more accurately, not really being treated at all. Historically, like much of the world, the UK managed mental illness and psychological disorders through hospitalisation, particularly in the public mental asylums, which had been in place since the Victorian era. By the start of the 20th century, the asylum population in England had grown to over 100,000 people. And it's important to note that when we talk about people being committed to asylums, we're not just talking about individuals suffering from severe psychiatric conditions like psychosis. Many were institutionalized for conditions that today would be managed with therapy, medication, or community support. So things like panic disorders, agoraphobia, postnatal depression, and even epilepsy. The list of reasons for committal was alarmingly broad, and sadly, for many people, once they were inside the asylum, they never left. Throughout the 20th century, various radical treatments were trialled, often on asylum patients, who were essentially treated as guinea pigs. These included electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, lobotomies, experimental drug treatments, and various other brutal procedures that have long since been discredited. By the mid-1950s, there were over 150,000 people in mental hospitals, the highest number in UK history. By this point, though, the system was starting to be questioned, not just on a moral level, but importantly for the government of the day, a financial one. Running these vast institutions was expensive, and with changing attitudes towards mental health, people were beginning to ask whether the asylum system was actually still fit for purpose. In 1959, the Conservative government passed a new Mental Health Act, which introduced a supposedly more compassionate approach to treatment. Then, in the early 1960s, the Minister for Health, who, incidentally, was a young politician by the name of Enoch Powell, and if you look him up, you'll see everything you will ever want to find out about him, spoke about his plans to close the asylums entirely. By 1971, a government paper titled Hospital Services for the Mentally Ill proposed abolishing the mental hospital system altogether, shifting care to district general hospitals and community services. Now that all sounds good in theory, of course, but then Britain hit a recession. By the mid-1970s, drastic cuts in health spending meant that this transition was not well planned, nor was it properly funded. The number of beds in asylums had to be drastically reduced, and at many hospitals, the process was both blunt and brutal. Wards were shut down one by one, and whenever a patient died or was discharged, their bed was physically removed, so there was no longer a space for a new admission. General practitioners who wanted to refer a patient for observation were often told that there were no beds left. The idea was that people would now be, quote, cared for in the community, end quote. But in practice, many former patients were simply released onto the streets with little or no support at all. It was against this backdrop that Pete Walker made his movie. And while he often said in interviews that the social commentary in his films was there to get past the censors, there to provoke, and there to make money, the theme of mental health care in Frightmare seems to have been much more deeply felt. Here's an interview with Walker in 1976. Quote, "I won't talk a lot of humbug, but I literally did believe that people were being let out of jails and mental asylums before they were properly cured. The week before the film went to the censor, a man was released from Broadmoor by a lot of well-meaning psychiatrists who said he was ready to take his place in society again. A week later, he killed 2 more children. I was just saying we should be more careful." End quote. And then in an interview in 1998, he was even more blunt, saying, quote, "I do think that psychiatry, counselling and all of this is a load of rubbish. It's an overrated profession, and that's my feeling on it." End quote. So just to repeat myself, these are Pete Walker's views and not mine, but I think it's really important to understand this perspective because it is central to what the film is saying and also why it got the reaction that it did. The film, as I mentioned, came in for a lot of criticism when it was released, with the newspaper The Sun, and I have to say here that the irony is beyond comprehension, described it as, quote, "The real obscenity of this sordid little movie is the message that the mentally sick breed insane children and should be locked up for life if found guilty of a criminal act." End quote. Yes, that was indeed the Sun newspaper. Meanwhile, in the Monthly Film Bulletin in January 1975, David Perry wrote, quote, "The message seems to be that the mentally ill should be locked up forever, and the implicit attitude towards insanity is thoroughly unpleasant." End quote. To be honest, watching this film in hindsight without the historical context, it's fairly easy to miss this message and dismiss the film as a simple shocker. But Frightmare played directly into the fears that people and society had at the time. The idea that dangerous individuals were being released into the community because of a system that was prioritising budgets over safety. And those fears weren't entirely unfounded. There were real cases of violent offenders being released only to re-offend. But, of course, these were the exceptions and not the rule. Walker, as a horror movie director and an exploitation cinema producer, was not really interested in nuance, as we've seen from my description of The House of Mortal Sin. He was making horror movies, and he knew that public anxieties about crime, violence, and mental illness were ripe for exploitation. You can see this theme running right throughout the movie. The psychiatrists in the film are presented as ineffectual, interfering, and ultimately clueless about what they're dealing with. It's been pointed out more than once that the climax, in which a well-intentioned but ultimately self-absorbed doctor quite literally has his head examined, is one of the explicit examples of Walker's contempt for the profession. Another doctor's ludicrous explanation of Dorothy's condition also seems designed to raise as many ironic laughs as it does chills. He states that her cannibalism can be explained and understood as a way of her coping with childhood trauma. And what was that trauma? Well, she found out that she had eaten parts of her pet rabbit, which her parents had cooked and served as dinner, due to food shortages during the war. You can draw your own conclusions about where you stand on the film's message. Many people have chosen to ignore these themes altogether, and instead focus on the film's critique of supposed family values, which, as I mentioned, were one of the main agendas of the Festival of Light and the so-called morality movement. And it's a very good point to make. In Walker's film, the family unit is not a place of love and support, it's actually a breeding ground for insanity. A force of destruction that will quite literally eat you alive unless you find an escape route. And even outside of the family unit, the world of the film is harsh, unforgiving, and unloving. We've already discussed the bleak and downbeat opening, but this is very much underlined by the fact that all bar one of Dorothy's victims are isolated and alone. They're lost souls, people who are seeking solace and hope in her tarot card readings, only to meet a brutal and bloody end. Even Debbie's thrilled excitement at the death of her lover at the hands of her mother seems to be a commentary on the futility of youthful romance. Misanthropic doesn't even begin to cut it. Despite this bleakness, and Frightmare is a relentlessly bleak movie, there is also a strong undercurrent of very dark, ironic humour running through it. Admittedly, you have to look pretty hard to find it, though. For example, Jackie and Graham's date night consists of them going to see the film La Grande Bouffe, a movie in which the protagonists quite literally eat themselves to death. Now, this is not just a throwaway reference. La Grande Bouffe was one of the films that the Festival of Light had publicly campaigned against. Its inclusion here is, to my mind, very clearly Walker and McGillivray thumbing their noses at the modern morality movement, deliberately poking fun at the kind of reactionary censorship that was trying to dictate what audiences could and couldn't watch. It's a small detail, but it's a very telling one, and one that fits in perfectly with Frightmare's deeply cynical view of society. For me, though, what really elevates, or actually carries the film, are the performances, most notably of Sheila Keith and Rupert Davies. Sheila Keith's performance as Dorothy, the cannibalistic mother who dispatches her victims with pitchforks, red-hot pokers, and electric power drills, is absolutely ferocious and is completely terrifying in that ferocity. Even when she's not actively ripping her victims apart, there is something deeply unsettling about her nice middle-class lady act. Even before the true nature of her crimes are revealed, you can sense that there is something very, very, very wrong with Dorothy. She's first introduced by the light of a glowing fire, and following a hushed and conspiratorial conversation between her husband Edmund and her stepdaughter Jackie. And even without that build-up, from the moment she enters and politely coos, "Good evening, Jackie," in a clipped and middle-class accent, there's an immediate sense of discomfort. Walker has said that this was inspired very much by his own mother, who was able to sound unbelievably polite whilst also sticking the knife in, though in Dorothy's case, sticking the knife in happens quite literally. Sheila Keith's ability to switch from a kindly old lady to a feral killer and then later to an almost childlike dependence on her husband is startling. Her reaction when a soon-to-be victim calls her crazy, moving from hurt to angry to psychotic within a few seconds, is really quite something to behold, and without her, the film wouldn't really have so much of its power. Her performance in this, and in Pete Walker's other movies, is a long way from the cosy British sitcoms in which she made her name, and her recurrent role in the daytime British soap Crossroads, with its famously wobbly cardboard sets. Walker had previously cast her in his earlier film The House of Whipcord, and he later said of that process, quote, "She walked into the office, and I knew her as a comedy actress, actually, but she came in and she had this thing about her. Comedians and comedy actors make wonderful villains because they're much more uninhibited, and so I took a chance on her." End quote. And what a chance it was. Sheila Keith is certainly uninhibited in her performances, and if nothing else, Walker has secured her a place in horror history as one of the most terrifying older women in the genre. Move over Bette Davis, you've got nothing on our Sheila. She's more than ably supported by Rupert Davies as her overly devoted and codependent enabling husband. Davies had made his name playing the detective Maigret on British television, and this was a role that he struggled to escape from. He'd also already appeared in several horror films, including Dracula Has Risen from the Grave from Hammer Movies and Michael Reeves' Witchfinder General. His performance here is both heartbreaking and also unbelievably frustrating. You basically want to slap him round the face and tell him to wake the fuck up. He enables Dorothy's crimes to such an extent that he eventually becomes complicit in the murder of his own daughter, standing by impotently as Dorothy and the psychotic Debbie advance in the film's unbelievably bleak and downbeat climax. At the time, the Sun, that bastion of morality and good taste, questioned what Davies was doing in a film like this, and that's pretty rich coming from them. But even the Daily Mail had to grudgingly admit that, quote, "the film contains unnerving performances, especially from Rupert Davies and Sheila Keith," end quote. Davies's role in the film is tragic, and his slow, painful realization of just how much of a monster his wife really is gives Frightmare an emotional depth that it wouldn't otherwise have. As for the rest of the cast, Deborah Fairfax and Paul Greenwood are absolutely fine as the protagonists. And then there's Kim Butcher as Debbie, who, and I say this with complete respect, is possibly one of the most irritating characters in 1970s horror cinema. Kim Butcher was allegedly 16 or 17 when she played the role, and much like Mia Goth in Infinity Pool, she is at once both terrifying and unbelievably annoying. And again, much like Mia Goth in Infinity Pool, I found myself watching the movie hoping she would receive some kind of comeuppance, if only to shut her the hell up. As you can tell from this brief description, Walker's films are never subtle, and Frightmare is no exception. It's cynical, it's violent, and it wears its themes very much on its sleeve. Whether you agree with its stance on psychiatry or its deeply pessimistic take on the family unit, it's entirely up to you. But it is a powerful piece of British exploitation cinema, and it absolutely makes its mark. And love it or hate it, it's pretty impossible to forget. And now we move on to our second film in this week's double bill, which is Possum, released in 2018, written and directed by Matthew Holness, and starring Sean Harris and Alan Armstrong. Matthew Holness is an English actor, writer and director, and he was born in Whitstable in Kent, which was, incidentally, the hometown of legendary hammer horror icon Peter Cushing. Holness has spoken in interviews about how growing up in Cushing's shadow actually had a huge impact on him, and his love of horror movies started early. He recounts that at the age of 6 he met Peter Cushing and asked for his autograph, to which the older actor reportedly responded with some concern, surprised that a small child knew so much about horror films. In the UK, Holness is probably best known for his fictional alter ego Garth Marenghi, a self-proclaimed, quote, author, dreamweaver, visionary, plus actor, end quote. Holness co-created the character with Richard Ayoade, and their stage shows, Garth Marenghi's Fright Night and Garth Marenghi's Netherhead, won acclaim at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, even winning the prestigious Perrier Comedy Award. This led to the cult Channel 4 TV series Garth Marenghi's Dark Place in 2004, which parodied low-budget horror and sci-fi television. Outside of Dark Place, Holness has had a very varied acting career, appearing in British comedies and dramas, including Toast of London and Friday Night Dinner. More recently, he also had a significant role in Mike Flanagan's horror anthology The Haunting of Bly Manor in 2020. What many people, however, might not know is that alongside his comedic work, Holness has been quietly carving out a serious career as a writer and director of dark, unsettling psychological horror. Before Possum, he directed a series of short films, including A Gun for George in 2011, which is available to watch on YouTube, and again, I will link it in our show notes. This is a short film about a washed-up pulp fiction crime writer, and it really captures the spirit of the 1970s described earlier, all brown interiors and washed-out colour schemes. In fact, narrative aside, visually it could easily have aired on BBC Two in 1977. Then there was The Snipist in 2012, a dystopian thriller set in an alternate 1970s Britain, which has been overrun by, you guessed it, rabies. And then Smutch in 2016, a Halloween horror comedy about an embittered author haunted by a ghostwriter. All of this led up to Possum, his feature-length directorial debut, which was released in 2018. Possum didn't begin life as a film or a film script. It started life as a short story, written by Holness for a 2008 collection entitled The New Uncanny, Tales of Unease. This was a project in which writers were invited to read Sigmund Freud's theory of the uncanny, choose a fear that intrigued them, and write a modern horror story around it. Holness, for his inspiration, picked two fears. First of all, the fear of the doppelganger, or the horror of encountering a sinister double of yourself. And secondly, the fear of the ventriloquist puppet, which, as horror fans know, has a long history of unsettling audiences in films like Dead of Night or Magic. From a literary angle, Holness has cited influences such as Thomas Ligotti, who frequently explores themes of puppets, doubles, and the uncanny in his work. He therefore set out to create a protagonist who was a puppeteer, haunted by his own monstrous creation, essentially a dead twin, but in puppet form. The story was published in 2008, but it wasn't until 2016 that the film Possum first became public knowledge, when a press release was issued, officially announcing the production. The description given at the time immediately positioned Possum as something that was steeped in psychological horror, classic cinematic influences, and the spirit of the 1970s, and described the film as, quote, a supernatural horror combining the stark psychodrama of George Romero's Martin with the uncanny terror of Dead of Night. The film draws on the dark nightmares of silent expressionist horror, British classics such as The Innocents and Don't Look Now, as well as the claustrophobic suburban gothic of Pete Walker's Frightmare. Possum will terrify in the best tradition of classic horror cinema, evoking an atmosphere of supernatural dread and creeping horror. End quote. Now, clearly, quite a bit changed between the press release and the final end product. Possum isn't a supernatural film at all, although the phrase creeping horror is certainly an apt one. Possum is very much a film of atmosphere, a waking nightmare, and it's one that lingers in the subconscious rather than one that delivers overt scares. Matthew Holness has been very clear about this in his interviews, stating that he wanted to make a film that didn't feel like a film, but more like a nightmare captured on celluloid. And he went on to say, quote, "I was interested in the idea of a horror film that feels like a decayed artifact from the past, something institutional, clinical, but off-kilter, like a lost British public information film." End quote. We've spoken about these public information films already, and you can watch many of them on YouTube. And in doing so, you can see exactly what Holness was aiming for. But as well as the drab and oppressive locations that one could quite easily find in a 5-minute short about the dangers of building sites, the visuals of the film are also very reminiscent of the work of a British artist called George Shaw. In fact, the locations in Possum, filmed in Norfolk, could actually have been lifted straight from a George Shaw painting. If you're watching this video on YouTube, I will insert some of Shaw's paintings here, and you can see that there is a clear synergy between the suburbs caught by his paintbrush and those captured in Possum by Kit Fraser's cinematography. If you're listening to this podcast, I highly recommend a quick Google search to see what I mean. Born in Coventry in 1966 and raised on the Tile Hill Council estate, Shaw has spent his entire career documenting the banality and quiet desolation of post-war British suburbia. He uses an enamel paint, which is better known for its usage in model kits than fine art, and he paints scenes of garages, pathways, scrubland and cul-de-sacs with a devotional and haunting precision. In Possum, Matthew Holness and Kit Fraser capture the same aesthetic: boarded up schools, litter-strewn underpasses, and the stagnant green of neglected woodland at the edge of a council estate. These are places, much like in Shaw's work, that feel held together by silence and by mildew. This blending of the everyday and the terrifying, and the feeling that horror is lurking beneath the surface of everyday life, is something that the film also shares with a series of booklets called The Occultaria of Albion, which explore fictional locations in Britain and where the uncanny seeps through the cracks of everyday reality. These booklets are written in the style of a found document or an old paranormal investigation report, and they present small towns, abandoned houses, motorway service stations, fairly ordinary, dull places, and fill them with strange disappearances, bizarre cults, and inexplicable phenomena. Now, they might not have written a pamphlet about the town that Philip repetitively explores in Possum, but one should surely be on the drawing board by now. Despite the occasional glimpse of other people, the suburban town that Philip compulsively explores during the film feels strangely empty. It's a world that is abandoned and alone. A word that best describes this feeling is really a word that doesn't exist at all, but can be found in the pages of the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows by the writer John Koenig. This is a collection of emotions that we all feel but didn't have the words to express until Koenig created them. And that word is kenopsia. This is defined in the book as an eerie, forlorn atmosphere of a place that's usually bustling with people but is now abandoned and quiet. A school hallway in the evening, an unlit office on a weekend, vacant fairgrounds, an emotional after-image that makes it seem not just empty, but hyper-empty, with a total population in the negative, who are so conspicuously absent that they glow like neon signs. If that doesn't describe the locations and settings of Possum, then I really don't know what does. These unsettling landscapes are made all the more disturbing by the oppressive soundtrack, which is courtesy of the Radiophonic Workshop, another throwback to the weird TV programmes of Holness's childhood in the 1970s. I appreciate that many people listening to this aren't going to be overtly familiar with the work of the Radiophonic Workshop, so let's just have a little chat about them. Created in 1958 by Desmond Briscoe and Daphne Oram, the workshop began life buried deep in the BBC's Maida Vale studios, rooms 13 and 14 to be specific, and were tasked with creating strange new sounds for BBC radio programmes. Now, this, of course, was a time where you couldn't just pull a spooky drone off a sound library shelf. If you wanted to create what existential dread sounded like, somebody had to build it from scratch, using loops of tape, sine wave oscillators, and, quite often, bits of broken piano. The Radiophonic Workshop quickly became the BBC's house of sonic oddities, crafting the atmosphere for everything from Quatermass and the Pit to, perhaps most famously of all, the theme music to Doctor Who. Through the 1960s and 70s, it was the in-house conjurer of mood and menace, and defined the sound of British science fiction, children's television, and of course, public information films. But by the early 90s, things began to change. The BBC decided that departments had to turn a profit or be closed. The Radiophonic Workshop, never exactly a money spinner, was given 5 years to become financially viable, and sadly, it didn't. And so in 1998, it was quietly shut down. And that was that. Except, of course, fortunately for us, it wasn't. In the early 2000s, interest in the workshop's legacy began to swell. There were documentaries, interviews, and vinyl reissues. And in 2009, original members reunited for a live show at London's Roundhouse, performing their classic works in surround sound with a brass section and a drummer. By 2013, they had dropped the title BBC and were performing under the name The Radiophonic Workshop, collaborating with electronic artists and releasing new material. Their influence on electronic music, meanwhile, is everywhere. Pink Floyd visited the workshop in the 1960s, and Brian Jones dropped by in 1968. Artists like the Aphex Twin, the Orb, and many others have all paid sonic tribute to the workshop's uncanny atmosphere. And in fact, most genres of electronic music do indeed owe a quiet debt to that modest pair of rooms in the BBC's Maida Vale studios. And then, after 60 years of soundtracking pretty much everything but cinema, the workshop made their feature-length soundtrack debut with Possum. And the soundtrack is not so much music as it is a menacing presence, humming behind the wallpaper. It's genuinely disturbing, and is the perfect marriage of old-school British hauntology and modern psychological horror. And whilst the Radiophonic Workshop provides the sounds of Possum, the faces of the film belong to the quite brilliant performances of Sean Harris and Alan Armstrong. I've managed to talk at length about Possum without getting into any spoilers, and I'm incredibly proud of myself for doing so. But now I'm probably about to. So if you haven't seen the film, track it down and come back. Holness has spoken at length about the importance of casting Sean Harris in the role, stating, quote, "I didn't want an actor who would come on set and say, okay, let's talk about this, let's explore this character and the backstory. I needed somebody who would just inhabit it completely. Sean doesn't talk about the character, he just becomes it." End quote. Holness later went on to say that, quote, "Sean really threw himself into it, and I think the result is something extraordinary. He's so raw in the film, you can see every layer of Philip's pain just written into his face." End quote. Harris is renowned for his intense physical approach to acting, and as Holness says, his performance as Philip is painfully immersive. Philip is a man suffocating under the weight of his own past, and Harris plays him as though he is physically wearing that trauma. His shoulders are pulled forward, as if he is constantly trying to make himself smaller. His voice is cracking under the weight of things left unsaid. Every movement, every nervous tick, every halting breath feels like it has been dragged from the depths of Philip's suffering. Possum is a slow and agonizing portrait of a mind in retreat, and Harris's performance is one of a man's quiet and suffocating descent into himself. In the original story, which is told through first-person narration, we discover that Philip has lined the interior of the possum puppet with razor blades and other painfully sharp objects, and that the puppet is as much a device for self-harm as it is anything else. We also learn that it would act as a force of violent disruption in Philip's puppet shows, crashing through more homely narratives and terrifying the children in the audience. These elements, perhaps fortunately for the viewer, are left out of the film, though the spider-legged puppet, which keeps returning despite Philip's many attempts to rid himself of it, acts as an ongoing reminder of the abuse that Philip suffered as a child, creeping around corners, staring from mirrors, and in one particularly disturbing moment, even sharing his bed. If Philip is slowly suffocating, then his Uncle Morris, played with a terrifyingly joyful malignance by the great Alan Armstrong, is the person who's pushing him under, a relic of a childhood horror that Philip is desperate to escape, but keeps returning to. Holness has described Morris as, quote, a malignant presence, unquote, stating that he is the reason Philip is the way he is. Morris is the spectre of an abuse that never really went away. He's like a stain that cannot be washed out. What makes Armstrong's performance so chilling is how he plays Morris with an almost playful cruelty. He toys with Philip, his voice taunting, his words dripping with mocking affection and malignance, coming across like a spider, lazily prodding at a struggling fly caught in its web. This spider imagery is fitting, not just because of the many-legged puppet that haunts Philip's nightmares, but because all Morris has to do is sit and wait in his lair for his victim to return. The home in which he lives is essentially a giant web, dark and festering, practically oozing with rot and decay. Morris lurks in the shadows, waiting patiently, knowing that Philip has nowhere else to go. Holness elaborates on Armstrong's chilling approach to the role, saying, quote, Alan was terrifying. He just understood Morris completely. The way he plays him is so insidious because it's not this overt theatrical villainy. It's small. It's everyday. It's how abusers behave in the real world. End quote. And that's what makes the character so horrifying. He isn't some Grand Guignol monstrous figure. He's something far worse. He is the banality of evil. An abuser who laughs at his victim, who delights in their weaknesses, and who revels in the power that he still holds. Where Philip is locked in a constant cycle of self-destruction, Morris is comfortable. He knows he has won, and he knows that Philip can never truly escape. At times he is amused by Philip's suffering, and Holness has remarked on how the character's laughter is probably the most chilling thing in the film, saying, quote, there's a moment when Morris laughs, and it's just horrible. It's the laughter of somebody who enjoys what they do, who sees no problem with it. And that, for me, is true horror. And that is perhaps what makes the movie one of the most devastating horror films of recent years. Holness understands that true horror doesn't come from ghosts or monsters, and that sometimes the real terror is just a man sitting in a darkened room, waiting and knowing that you'll come back. On the surface, Possum and Frightmare seem like vastly different films. One is an atmospheric, nightmarish British psychological horror, and the other is a gritty, shocking exploitation film. But at their core, both films explore one of the most disturbing concepts in horror cinema, and that is of the family being a place of fear, control, and destruction. Both films present the home, a supposed sanctuary, as a trap, a place that should offer love and protection, but instead fosters violence, psychological torment, and an inescapable cycle of trauma. The horror in these movies doesn't come from some external force, but from the people who should be closest to you. Both films also, admittedly from very different perspectives, depict the impact of a lack of care in the community, and what happens when mental health support is withdrawn, or indeed never provided. Much like in Frightmare, at the beginning of Possum, Philip is released from what seems to be an institution, though it's never clearly stated what kind. Is it a hospital? Is it a prison? Is it something in between? The ambiguity is intentional. Unlike Frightmare, though, Holness doesn't offer us anything neat and tidy as a diagnosis. There's no helpful psychiatrist to wrap things up with a bow and explain away what we are viewing. And where Dorothy, never really cured and masquerading as sane to manipulate her family, is quite happy to resume her murderous mischief, Philip slowly disintegrates as he tries to hold on to his sanity. He drifts through the film like a phantom, stalked by a spider-legged puppet representing the memories he's tried so hard to repress. It's never fully clear whether we're witnessing a relapse, a reckoning, or the final unravelling of a man who was never stitched back together properly in the first place, and who is desperately trying to cling on to his sanity and his hope. And if we're honest with ourselves, that's probably the more frightening story. So that's it for this week's rather depressing horror double bill. thanks again for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps to spread the word. And if you've got horror-loving friends, please consider sharing our links and socials. You can follow me on Instagram at the Horror Double Bill for all the extras, oddities, and updates. And also a reminder that I would love to hear from you. So if you have any thoughts about this week's episode, or have memories of Britain in the 1970s and the horrors of public information films, please do drop me a line at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. Next Sunday, given the time of year, we're going on a summer holiday and exploring the adventures of the open road. We're starting off on a cycling holiday through France with the 1971 thriller And Soon the Darkness, and make sure you watch the 1970s version and not the remake. And we're following that with The Hitcher from 1986. If you want to track them down before discussion, they are both currently available for rent on Amazon Prime. Not sponsored, by the way. Watch them if you can, and I'll see you next week for a discussion. Until then, have a really good week. Thank you again for listening, and goodbye.